Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. Today, we're going to be talking about the Path of Exile 2 meta so far. This is the meta that's developed over the nearly 4 months since early access began. We're going to be taking a look at the top performers in that time, and we're also going to be having a look at some of the hidden gems that might dodge the nerf bat when 0.2.0's patch notes are hopefully released in a couple of days' time. Now, everything in Path of Exile 2 is going to change in a few days' time. This is going to be a little bit of a look back, partly for nostalgia reasons, but it can also help you identify any builds that might be hidden gems at the moment, might be flying a little bit under the radar, and might be pushed into prominence if everything better than them ends up getting nerfed. Or alternately, it can also help point out some things that no one's managed to make work yet, and if those get small buffs, then chances are that's not going to be enough to make them good. Of course, if they end up getting massive buffs, those sorts of things can end up being catapulted either into the center of the meta, or at least forward enough that they end up feeling like compelling choices to play. Now, I'm going to talk quickly about the methodology that I use whenever I'm assessing the meta in Path of Exile 1 or 2. Grinding Games publish a ladder. Path of Exile 1, it's top 15,000 players by XP. Path of Exile 2, it's only 1,000. But in Path of Exile 1, this gives a lot of information about those characters. In Path of Exile 2, all it gives you is the character name and the Ascendancy class that they're playing and their current exact XP count. However, Grinding Games are working on an API that's not yet completely finished that will allow players to be able to look up other characters. People can opt out of this, but in Path of Exile 1, it lets you look up characters just based on their character name and then see all the gems they've got equipped, see all the items that they've got equipped, see their exact passive tree, and so on and so forth. Now, there is a data aggregation website, POE2.ninja, that has early access to this API. The API is not yet at a point that it can be released to the general public, but it is there for POE2.ninja, and as a result, that website has a whole bunch of information, far more than you can get from the ladder. Ninja also picks a few people that are not currently on the ladder to track as well, people that have been on the ladder in the past, and people that are actively involved in trading and are playing on high-level characters. Because of this, I have to cut off somewhere, and I've decided I'm cutting off at level 97 and above characters. So everything for the rest of this video is only considering how those builds have been going on level 97 plus characters. I want to start by taking a look at the top standout uniques of early access. Now, I am going to deliberately exclude what I term modal uniques. These are things like Megalomaniac, where there's just 1,000,001 different versions of the same unique. Megalomaniac is a really good item. It's used by a very large number of people, but one that's perfect for a Hand of Wisdom and Action crossbow user is not going to be of any use to someone that is playing a Spark and Archmage character. In that sense, I'd sort of consider those to be separate items. However, it's a bit unclear where you draw the line as to what's a modal unique and what isn't. I'm counting Prism of Belief as being modal, I'm counting Megalomaniac as being modal, but I'm not counting Moroya Invictus. If you think Moroya Invictus is too much of a modal unique, then you can always disregard it, and then you'll have the top 9 standout uniques instead of the top 10. And 91% of level 97 and above characters are using Ingenuity. More on that belt in a sec. 77% are using Melting Maelstrom, the unique flask. 45% are using Moroya Invictus. The main reason that I didn't consider Moroya Invictus to be modal is that there's a couple of different versions that are very overwhelmingly used, particularly ones that grant attributes and tri-elemental res based upon the number of socketed soul cores. Those are the ones that tend to be the most popular, and they're generally the ones that are used by almost everyone. There are exceptions, some people prefer Spirit, but ultimately it's not like all 21 versions of it are being used equally. Hand of Wisdom and Action comes in next at 40%. Controlled Metamorphosis comes in next at also at 40%. Pillar of the Cage God, 32%. Temporalis, 24%. More on that one later. Astromentus, 23%. This is the expensive part of the Hand of Wisdom and Action Astromentus combo, or the Pillar of the Cage God Astromentus combo, or using all three of them together. Mahoxidal's Machination comes in at 9th with 22%. And Trampletoe comes in at 10th with 20%. More on that one later as well, because that's not a unique that I think many people expected to see on this list, but there's a particularly broken use case for it. So let's start with the most important of these, and it's not the most used one, Ingenuity. It is Hand of Wisdom and Action. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is easily dismissed as, that's just some level 52 item, that's not very good. However, this is the defining gear piece for most characters that deal weapon damage with attacks. The amount of lightning damage that this adds to attacks is just off the planet compared to anything else in the game. It's quite simply the best item in the game. Nothing else comes remotely close. It is an affordable item, that's because it's not super rare, but this is still the most powerful item in Path of Exile in 0.1.0, and it will be interesting to see what versions of it exist after 0.2.0 comes along. Ingenuity is next, and this item single-handedly excludes enormous numbers of items from even the remotest consideration of being equipped. There is no such thing as a merit tier belt in Path of Exile 2 at the moment, because instead you would simply make your character better by removing it and replacing it with Ingenuity. There are of course exceptions, but not very many of them. That's why more than 90% of very high level characters are using this belt. On top of that, this belt being so overwhelmingly powerful means that rings that don't work with it, for example, Original Sin, these end up being extremely unpopular. Now, when I say it doesn't work, it's not like Original Sin explicitly bricks Ingenuity. It's just the one stat on Original Sin that you can't get anywhere else, the 100% conversion. This doesn't benefit from being scaled up to 180% or whatever the exact number ends up being. Temporalis is next. Temporalis had a cheating problem. This is intended to be like the Path of Exile 1 item Original Sin, that Path of Exile 2's Original Sin is loosely based upon. This was intended to be an extreme chase item, something that was going to be considerably harder to source in trade than a Mirror of Kalandra would be. However, there was a major item duplication exploit with this. I touched on it in an earlier video. It's all patched, but the damage is done. There's an enormous amount of these in circulation in a way that won't exist in the future. So Temporalis is going to be much rarer in future economies, and as a result, some of the builds that currently use it will be much more niche in the future than they were in 0.1.0. I don't think Temporalis will make top 10 lists of uniques that are being equipped, because I don't think there'll be enough of them in circulation in the future for that to be the case. Next, we have Trampletoe that needs to be discussed. Now, Trampletoe is the 10th most frequently equipped unique item, and this is likely to surprise a lot of people. This had some silly interactions that were discovered and popularized reasonably late in 0.1. It wasn't being used at all, then suddenly it exploded in popularity in a very short period of time. It is completely broken in conjunction with Frostwall and Temporalis. This is an interaction that's very unlikely to survive the patch notes. This is not otherwise a good item, and as a result, have a look what exactly happens to the Trampletoe setups, but I don't expect them to be a factor in 0.2.0 at all. Now, I've been talking about unique items that have been dominant, but let's talk about the other thing that's been really dominant, and this is Archmage. Archmage defines builds. It allows you to scale damage at the expense of forcing you to build a lot of mana recovery into your build, and also forcing a number of other changes onto your build. The thing is that Archmage is just unbelievably good, to the extent that it's just far better than everything else that you can do when it comes to scaling spells. Although there's a few different builds that use Archmage, and a few different builds that use Hand of Wisdom in action, and only one build that uses Trampletoe, although it can be played on a number of Ascendancies, 89% of builds are using one of these three methods in order to deal damage to enemies. Okay, so that's a quick look at offensive archetypes. Let's have a look at defensive archetypes next. 59% of players are using Chaos Inoculation, 55% Mind Over Matter, 31% Eldritch Battery, 23% Eternal Youth. And here's all of those keystones in case you're not familiar with them all. In terms of other defensive setups, the number of characters that have a large amount of life investment, I'm defining this as 3,000 plus for the moment, this is only 18%. The number of players with a high energy shield character, I'm defining this as 6,000 plus, 20%. The number of people with a high mana setup, which is 6,000 plus again, 25%. It's worth noting that because of Chaos Inoculation, you can play a character that completely disregards life and that puts all their investment into energy shield. And because of Mind Over Matter, you can play a character that disregards both life and energy shield, but places heavy investment into mana. Of course, in all of these cases, you've got to find some way to recover that resource, and Eternal Youth is a popular way to manipulate how you're able to do that. So what about armor and evasion investment? High armor, defining that as 6,000 or more, is less than 1% of the player base. There's pretty good reasons for this. Armor is not in a very good state in 0.1.0. High evasion rating characters, again defining as 6,000 plus, 4% of the player base. So this is not a trivial amount, but it's also not a large amount. And then there's a small number of people who are using ultra high evasion ratings, 20,000 or more, but these are almost all using the Queen of the Forest unique chest piece, which is an extremely strong chest piece, and one that's only worth using if you're making such an enormous investment. So let's take a quick look at all 12 Ascendancies. What was there that was super hyped before launch? Did it live up to that launch a couple of days into the league? And how did it go later on? I want to start with the Titan. The Titan pre-launch was modestly hyped, and I'm calling it B tier. That's a bit subjective, you might disagree with that, but it's something of that sort of ballpark. Its early performance was very much B tier, but then it's fallen off late. And I would say that it wound up in C tier. In terms of standouts in the way it's built, every single high-level Titan, there are no exceptions to this. Every single one of them takes hulking form. This is the 4-point node that adds 50% to the magnitude of small passives. This is incredibly good, and ultimately, whilst it's not enough to make melee strong, it's the strongest thing you can get if you decide to force melee anyway. Top skills here, Hammer of the Gods. Hammer of the Gods is the most used skill on a Titan, and it is there for doing one-shots to big bosses. Mostly this is for one-trick pony builds that aim to just literally one-shot delete boss monsters, but there are other ways that people use it as well. Herald of Ice is the other skill that's heavily used. Heralds are also something that's really, really strong, and a lot of players are expecting that they might not be quite as strong once the next patch comes along. That said, it might be Hand of Wisdom in action that takes the bullet for them. Warbringer is next, and pre-launch this was a little bit less hype than the Titan. Its early performance was less than the Titan, and its final performance has been pretty terrible. It's been dead last of all 12 Ascendancies. Only 20 characters have taken a Warbringer to level 97. Of those, only one has made it to level 99. That player has made it to level 100, but they are the only person who has exceeded 98 on this Ascendancy. There are no standout options. People are playing this just because they like the playstyle, or because they wanted to be the first and only level 100 Warbringer. Next up we have the Deadeye. This was not hyped very much pre-launch, but it was the strongest performer bar none early on. When I say S tier here, literally 1/3 of the ladder on day 3 was Deadeye's. And that's because the Deadeye is incredibly strong early on and also is one of the easier Ascendancies to build. Later on, it's continued to perform adequately, and I'm calling it a B tier overall performer. Not quite one of the best options, but not that far behind either. Standout build options here, definitely scaling bow damage through Hand of Wisdom in action. Hand of Wisdom in action will just consistently be better than any other way of scaling attack damage in the game. The other thing that Hand of Wisdom in action does is it makes items that you would otherwise probably not consider on a Deadeye, such as Astromentus, it makes them worth considering as well. What about the other ranged attack Ascendancy, the Pathfinder? The Pathfinder was interesting. It was probably the least hyped of the Ascendancies beforehand. It's one that's ported over from Path of Exile 1, so it didn't have shiny and new appeal, but it also didn't have anything that jumped out as looking fantastic either. Very little pre-launch hype, but it did perform pretty well early on. So I had it in C tier for its day 3 performance. It was doing pretty fine. What about later on? It sort of stayed in C tier. It didn't do any better, it didn't do any worse. It's a bit of a stretch to call this a standout, but the best way to play a Pathfinder definitely seemed to be Dual Heralds, Ice and Thunder, with, of course, Hand of Wisdom in action. This would then allow you to scale either bow damage or sometimes even concoction damage reasonably well. Next up we have the Chronomancer. A lot of people were talking about this prior to the launch of the game, and its early performance was terrible. It actually did pick up a little bit over time, but there's no true standout single player builds here. Instead, what we saw was curse support builds for party play. These were not a true standout, there's not a lot of them going around, but they definitely work reasonably well. Without those builds, the Chronomancer would actually be joining the Warbringer and the later Acolyte of Chayula all the way down in F tier. So from a very unsuccessful caster archetype to a very successful one, we have the Stormweaver next. Pre-launch, this was actually hyped quite a lot, and it lived up to but did not exceed the hype early on. It was either second or third most popular Ascendancy early on, but it was a long way behind the Deadeye. However, late performance for this was absolutely S tier. This is the most popular Ascendancy late in the 0.1.0 meta, and it's because Archmage is simultaneously extremely good and extremely well suited to the Stormweaver. Archmage is just absolutely dominant here. 86% of all Archmage characters have elected to play as a Stormweaver. 89% of all players who are playing a Stormweaver have elected to use Archmage. So you can see there's a tremendous amount of overlap there. The small number of people that aren't using Archmage, they're pretty much using the Trampletoe and Frostwall tech, but building that onto the Stormweaver rather than some of the other Ascendancies it's played on. If Archmage is nerfed, then this build could remain dominant, or it could become a dead Ascendancy, or it could go anywhere in between. We'll have to see on that once the patch notes come out. The Witchhunter is next, and this fell off quite a lot late, not necessarily because it was a bad Ascendancy, but just because it felt like the Gemling Legionnaire did everything better once you were well set up. Pre-launch, this was moderately hyped, and I'm putting it in B tier there. Early performance, so we're talking day 3 here. Again, it actually lived up to this hype. It was doing pretty well for itself, and I would call it B tier then. But later on, really fell off hard and wound up in D tier, and it's one of the lower performers in D tier as well. This is mostly played as a Hand of Wisdom in action crossbow build. So again, you're seeing the gloves are absolutely dominant, but this seems to do the Hand of Wisdom in action attack setup just a little bit worse than other alternatives did in terms of its overall success that players have been having with it. Gemling Legionnaire is next, and pre-launch, this was not super hyped, probably a B tier. Early performance was not very good on this class. We'll say a C tier, but its late performance was second best overall. So I'm calling this S- or A+ tier. It's really kind of hard. I don't want to put it in the same tier as the Stormweaver, but I also want to convey that with this tiering that it is above the Invoker. And again, this is mostly played as a Hand of Wisdom in action character. But when you think Gemling Legionnaire, and you see the artwork for it, you probably think, oh, this is going to be a crossbow character. That can be done, but it's not the main way people play this. The primary way is using Pillar of the Caged God. This very common unique staff is incredibly good in conjunction with Hand of Wisdom in action, and in particular in conjunction with the very expensive Astramentus. This setup is the best of all of the Astramentus setups that exist, and it is playable without the super expensive, super rare unique amulet. Next we have the Invoker. Now, the Invoker was interesting. It started out as the most hyped class pre-launch. It then fell off pretty hard. It did not perform up to the expectations people had of it in the very early days. But since then, it's improved, and it's now the third top overall Ascendancy out of all of the options. Invoker was one of those things that was just tough to optimize, but that got done, and now it's the third most popular endgame Ascendancy. Again though, when it comes to build diversity, there's not a huge amount of it at the moment. It is either going to be using a Hand of Wisdom in action setup or a Trampletoe setup. That is overwhelmingly how people are scaling their damage if they're playing an Invoker in Path of Exile 2.0.1.0. And from the very successful Monk archetype to the slightly less successful Acolyte of Chayula. Pre-launch hype for this was probably about C tier. There's a cool idea to it, but people were aware from the original teasers of the Ascendancy that it didn't look like it was very strong. However, early performance by day 3, it was terrible. It was F tier, and it was the actual outright worst performer then. It has ticked up in the days since from very bottom position to second bottom position, so you can say it's had a little bit of an improvement there. But just like the Warbringer, there is only one person who has taken an Acolyte of Chayula to level 99 or above. And again, they did take it to level 100. Are there any standout options for the Acolyte of Chayula? No, there are not. That said, keep your eye on this. I'm sure Grinding You Games are aware that this class needed some help, so who knows, maybe it's got it, or maybe it'll end up being left out again. And next we have the Blood Mage. The Blood Mage is in a really interesting spot. This was super hyped before the game started. Then we found out the details of the Blood Mage Ascendancy, and it didn't look so great. The first node, Sanguimancy, is a net drawback, and you really had to invest 2 points into the Life Leech nodes just in order to break even, and then it felt like your first 4 points only really got you back to where an unascended witch would be, and after that you did have 2 good points that you could spend, but that's going to take a little while to get, and even when you've got them, they're not necessarily as good as getting 4 points in a different Ascendancy. Early performance for this build was derisory. Solidly in F tier, this was one of the worst performers early on. However, it's picked up a lot since then, wound up in B tier in late performance. The thing that's worth noting though, this has been hard carried by the Trampletoe interaction. If we remove those characters that are using Trampletoe from Blood Mage consideration, performance is closer to that of Pathfinder, i.e. it's pretty close to the dumpster but not quite in it. Standout options though, there is a genuinely impressive critical strike focused Detonate Dead Blood Mage. It's flown under the radar quite a bit. I think it's a really good setup, and it's something to definitely consider if you're looking to play a Blood Mage in 0.2.0. And finally we have the Infernalist. Pre-launch this was hyped quite a bit. I'd put it in A tier. Its early performance was also A tier. Late performance has ticked back a little bit, down to B tier. But the thing that's important, Infernalists are usually in this weird spot where they're a minion build that's forced into the weird position of using Trench Timber in one hand and a Scepter in the other. And this is because plus gem levels are so powerful that you can't skip a large source of it. That said, this gives them a large boost to the amount of minion gem levels they can get. There are no individual minion gems that eclipse all of the others so far. There's a wide range of different setups that people are using, and the Infernalist is pretty good with all of them. This is a strong all-around class, and it's something that I think is worth seriously considering for your League starter in 0.2.0, assuming it dodges the nerf bat, and the endgame performance of this build is not so oppressively good that grinding gear games would be under any real pressure to nerf it. So it's entirely plausible that this dodges a nerf bat and ends up being one of the best choices to start in 0.2.0. Who knows though, maybe it will end up getting nerfed, maybe something else will get buffed past it, or maybe one of Archmage, Hand of Wisdom in Action, and Trampletoe either gets not nerfed at all or gets under-nerfed, and in that case, that particular build choice will end up squeezing out Infernalists from consideration for a lot of people. Anyways, some final thoughts. If there are no substantial nerfs to Hand of Wisdom in Action, play a Hand of Wisdom in Action build. If there's no substantial nerfs to Trampletoe, play that build. If there's no substantial nerfs to Archmage, then play Archmage. But if those three extreme outliers are dealt with, then we can expect to see a lot more build diversity in 0.2.0. Something that's really been missing in this meta overview, where there's essentially been three ways that players have been scaling their damage, plus the small fourth one when it comes to the Infernalist. That's all I've got on this. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.